The evening air was cold when walked into the grand city concert hall. She carried her violin case in her right hand and a heavy feeling in her heart. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Tonight was supposed to be ordinary. She had played in this orchestra for 3 years now, and she knew exactly what to expect. The same songs, the same rules, the same invisible feeling that came with being just another musician in the back row. Was 26 years old. She had dark brown hair that she always tied back in a neat bun for performances. Her eyes were the color of honey, and they held a sadness that most people never noticed. She smiled often, but it rarely reached her eyes. She was polite. She was quiet. She was exactly what everyone expected her to be. The concert hall was already busy when she arrived. Musicians moved around the stage, tuning their instruments and checking their sheet music. The air smelled like old wood and expensive perfume from the early audience members finding their seats. Found her spot in the second violin section, third chair from the left. It was not a special seat. It was not a seat that anyone would remember. And that was fine. That was how it had always been. She opened her violin case and looked at the instrument inside. It was old, passed down from her grandmother who had died when was just a child. The wood was worn in places where fingers had pressed for decades. There were tiny scratches that told stories she would never fully know. This violin had seen things. It had played music that could only imagine. And now it sat in her hands, waiting to play the same simple notes it had played 100 times before. "You ready for tonight?" asked the cellist who sat nearby. He was a friendly man in his 40s with gray hair at his temples and a warm smile. Nodded, same as always. "That's the spirit," laughed. "Nothing exciting ever happens here anyway." He was right, of course. Nothing exciting ever happened in the Grand City Orchestra. They played classical music for wealthy people who came to feel cultured. They followed the conductor's every move. They never made mistakes, and they certainly never surprised anyone. Looked at her sheet music for the night. It was a piece by a composer she had played many times before. Her part was simple, background music, supporting notes that would blend into the larger sound and disappear. No one would hear her specifically. No one would know she was there. She was just one small voice in a very large choir. The conductor, Mr., walked onto the stage for the final rehearsal check. He was a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had been leading this orchestra for 15 years, and he ran it like a military operation. Every note had to be perfect. Every musician had to follow his lead without question. Creativity was not welcome here, only precision. "Remember," Mr. said, his voice cutting through the noise, "tonight we have important guests. The mayor is in the audience. Several music critics from the national papers. I expect perfection from each and every one of you. No mistakes, no surprises. We play exactly what is written, exactly as we have rehearsed." Felt her stomach tighten. No surprises. Those two words echoed in her mind like a warning. She had heard them so many times throughout her life, from her parents, from her teachers, from every person who had ever tried to shape her into something acceptable. The audience began to fill the seats as the musicians made their final preparations. Watch them come in. Men in expensive suits, women in elegant dresses. They looked so confident, so sure of their place in the world. Wondered what that felt like. She wondered what it was like to walk into a room and know that you belonged there, that your voice mattered, that people wanted to hear what you had to say. Her fingers touched the strings of her violin, and she felt that familiar restlessness stir inside her. It was a feeling she had learned to ignore over the years. A small fire that burned in her chest whenever she picked up her instrument. It whispered to her, telling her to play something different, something wild, something that came from her soul instead of a piece of paper. But she always pushed it down. She always silenced it, because that was what good musicians did. They followed the rules. They played what was written. They did not cause trouble. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the audience. Mr. took his place at the podium, his baton raised and ready, lifted her violin to her shoulder and placed her bow on the strings. Her heart was beating faster than usual, though she did not know why. This was just another performance, just another ordinary night. The first movement began and played her part perfectly. Her notes blended with the others, creating a wall of sound that was pleasant and forgettable. She watched Mister's hands, following every gesture, every command. She was a soldier in his army, doing exactly what she was told. But something was different tonight. With each passing minute, the restlessness inside her grew stronger. It pushed against her chest like a wild animal trying to escape a cage. Her fingers began to ache, not from playing, but from holding back, from playing the same safe notes while something else screamed to be released. She looked around at the other musicians. They all had the same expression, focused, controlled, empty. They were not making music. They were following orders. They were machines producing sounds that had been produced 1,000 times before. Thought about her grandmother. She had heard stories about how the old woman used to play, wild and free, with emotions pouring from every note. She had played at street corners and small cafes, making people laugh and cry with her music. She had never followed rules. She had never been ordinary. What would her grandmother think if she could see now? Sitting in the back row of a fancy orchestra, playing music that meant nothing, being invisible in a room full of invisible people. The second movement was about to begin. The part in this section was even simpler than before, just a few supporting notes here and there. Easy, forgettable, safe. Mister raised his baton. The orchestra prepared to play. And in that moment, something inside broke. It was not a loud break, not something anyone could see or hear, but she felt it. A wall that had been standing inside her for 26 years suddenly crumbled. The fire in her chest roared to life, bigger and brighter than it had ever been. She looked at her sheet music, at those simple, ordinary notes waiting to be played, and she made a decision. She was tired of being invisible, tired of following rules that made her feel dead inside, tired of playing music that meant nothing to anyone, including herself. Tonight would be different. Tonight, for the first time in her life, was going to stop being ordinary. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life or take the first step toward something incredible. All she knew was that she could not spend another moment pretending to be someone she was not. The baton came down. The orchestra began to play. And closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the fire inside her finally burn free. To understand what happened that night at the Grand City Concert Hall, you need to know where it came from. You need to know the girl she used to be before she became the quiet woman in the back row. Because the fire that burned inside her did not appear from nowhere. It had been building for a very long time. Was born in a small town 3 hours away from the city. Her parents were simple people who worked hard and expected their children to do the same. Her father fixed cars at a local garage. Her mother worked at a bakery, waking up before sunrise every day to make bread and pastries. They were good people, honest people, but they did not understand things like art and music and dreams. When was 5 years old, her grandmother came to live with them. Grandmother was different from anyone had ever known. She was small and thin, with wild gray hair that she never bothered to tame. Her hands were wrinkled but strong, and they moved like dancing birds whenever she talked. And she always had her violin with her, an old instrument that seemed to glow with a life of its own. Grandmother had traveled the world when she was young. She had played her violin in the streets of Paris, in the cafes of Rome, in the village squares of small towns whose names could not pronounce. She had never been famous. She had never been rich, but she had been free. Music is not something you read from a paper, Grandmother used to say, her eyes sparkling with memory. Music is something you feel in your bones. It comes from here. She would press her hand against her heart, and it goes out into the world to touch the hearts of others. Was fascinated by her grandmother. She would sit for hours watching the old woman play, mesmerized by the way the music seemed to flow from her like water from a spring. There were no sheet music stands, no written notes, just grandmother and her violin having a conversation that needed no words. When was 7, her grandmother placed the violin in her small hands for the first time. "Close your eyes," she said softly. "Do not think, just feel." Closed her eyes. She drew the bow across the strings. The sound that came out was terrible, scratchy, and harsh, but grandmother just laughed. "That is the beginning," she said. "The beginning is always ugly, but beauty will come, you just have to let it." For 2 years grandmother taught to play, but her lessons were nothing like the ones would later receive in school. There were no scales, no exercises, no right or wrong ways to hold the bow. Instead, grandmother would ask to play what she was feeling. Play your happiness, play your sadness, play the sound of rain on the roof, play the feeling of sunshine on your face. Loved it. For the first time in her young life, she felt like she had found something that was truly hers. When she played, she was not the quiet girl who struggled to make friends at school. She was not the daughter who could never seem to make her parents proud. She was just speaking in a language that needed no words. But then, when was 9 years old, grandmother got sick. It happened quickly, the way terrible things often do. One day she was playing her violin in the garden, her music floating through the air like butterflies. The next day she was in a hospital bed, her hands too weak to hold anything at all. Sat beside her grandmother during those final days. She held the old woman's hand and tried not to cry. "Promise me something," grandmother whispered, her voice barely audible. "Promise me you will keep playing. Promise me you will not let them silence you." "I promise," said, tears streaming down her face. Grandmother smiled. It was the last time we'd see her smile. She died 3 days later, leaving behind her violin and a hole in her heart that would never fully heal. After the funeral, parents decided she needed proper music lessons. They found a teacher in town, a strict woman named Mrs. who believed that music was a science, not an art. She taught to read sheet music. She taught her scales and exercises and proper technique. She taught her to sit up straight, hold her bow correctly, and play exactly what was written on the page. "Your grandmother filled your head with nonsense," Mrs. said one day when tried to improvise. "Music is not about feelings. It is about discipline. It is about following the rules. If you want to be a real musician, you must learn to control yourself." Wanted to argue. She wanted to tell Mrs. about the magic she had felt when playing with her grandmother, but she was just a child, and children were taught to obey adults. So she nodded and kept her mouth shut. At school, things were not much better. Joined the school orchestra, hopping to find others who shared her love of music. But the orchestra was just like Mrs. Lessons. Everyone played the same notes at the same time in the same way. There was no room for creativity, no room for feeling, no room for the kind of music that grandmother had taught her to love. Parents were pleased with her progress. They liked that she was learning proper music now. They liked that she sat up straight and played from sheet music like a real musician. They did not understand why sometimes, late at night, they could hear strange, wild music coming from her room, music that did not sound like anything they had ever heard. "What was that noise?" her father asked one morning at breakfast. "Nothing," said quickly, "just practicing." "Well, practice the right way," her mother said. "Play the songs your teacher gives you. Do not make up strange sounds." Nodded and said nothing, but inside, a small part of her died. She learned to keep her real music hidden, like a secret she was ashamed of. She wrote compositions in notebooks that she kept under her bed. She played them only when she was sure no one could hear. And slowly, year by year, she built a wall between the girl she was expected to be and the musician she truly was. By the time went to music college, the wall was very high. She had become exactly what everyone wanted her to be. A technically perfect player with no personality. A musician who could play any piece of sheet music flawlessly but had never once surprised an audience. She graduated with honors and joined the Grand City Orchestra, where she found her place in the back row, playing her ordinary parts, being invisible. And for 3 years she stayed invisible. She played what she was told. She followed the rules. She kept her real music locked away in notebooks that she no longer even opened. But fire does not die easily. It can be buried. It can be hidden. It can be ignored, but it never truly goes away. It waits, burning quietly in the darkness, waiting for the moment when it can finally break free. That moment came on a cold evening at the Grand City Concert Hall, when looked at her sheet music and saw those simple, ordinary notes, when she felt the weight of 20 years of silence pressing down on her, when she remembered her grandmother's voice asking her to promise, asking her not to let them silence her. Had broken that promise. For 20 years she had let them silence her, but tonight, for the first time, she was going to keep it. Tonight, she was going to play the music that lived inside her, the music that grandmother had taught her to love, the music that she had hidden away for so long. She did not know if the world was ready to hear it. She did not know if she was ready to share it, but she knew that if she did not do it now, she might never do it at all, and she could not live with that. The baton came down. The orchestra began to play, and took a breath, opened her heart, and let the music finally speak. The second movement began with the soft sound of flutes. It was a gentle melody, peaceful and predictable, the kind of music that made wealthy people close their eyes and feel cultured. The violins were supposed to join in after 8 bars, adding a layer of harmony that would support the main theme without drawing any attention. Counted the bars in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her bow was ready. Her fingers were in position. Everything was exactly as it should be. 5, 6, 7. On bar 8, her hands were supposed to move. They were supposed to play the simple notes written on the page in front of her. C sharp, e.g. nothing special, nothing memorable, just 3 notes that would blend into the background and disappear. But her hands did not move. Sat frozen, her bow hovering above the strings. The other second violins played their parts perfectly, their notes rising into the air like obedient soldiers, but was silent. Her eyes were fixed on the sheet music, but she was not seeing the notes. She was seeing something else, a different path, a different possibility. 3 seconds passed. It felt like 3 hours. The musicians around her began to notice. Glanced over from his cello, his eyebrows raised in confusion. The first violin looked back with irritation. Mr. Sharp eyes found in the sea of players, and his face tightened with anger. But was not looking at any of them. She was looking inward, at the fire that burned in her chest, at the music that had been locked away for so long, begging to be released, at the promise she had made to a dying woman 20 years ago. And then she began to play. The notes that came from her violin were not on any sheet music. They were not part of any rehearsal. They were wild and strange and completely, utterly wrong. They clashed with the orchestra's careful harmony like a thunderstorm crashing into a peaceful garden. They rose and fell in patterns that made no logical sense, following rules that only understood. The other musicians stumbled. The flutes faltered. The cellos lost their rhythm. One by one, the members of the Grand City Orchestra stopped playing, unsure of what to do. The beautiful, predictable music fell apart like a house of cards in a strong wind. But did not stop. She could not stop. For the first time in 20 years, she was playing her real music, the music that lived in her soul, the music that grandmother had taught her to love, and it felt like flying. Her fingers danced across the strings with a freedom she had forgotten was possible. The sounds that came from her violin were not pretty in the traditional sense. They were raw and emotional and sometimes harsh, but they were alive. They were real. They were everything that the orchestra's music was not. In the audience, people began to whisper. Some looked confused, wondering if this was part of the performance. Others looked offended, as if they had been personally insulted by this break from tradition. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The music critics scribbled furious notes. Mister's face had turned a deep shade of red. His baton hung frozen in the air, useless now that no one was following his lead. He stared at with a mixture of rage and disbelief. In 15 years of conducting this orchestra, no one had ever dared. But was not looking at Mister. Her eyes were closed and her body swayed with the music that poured from her violin. She was no longer in the concert hall. She was somewhere else entirely, a place where rules did not exist, a place where the only thing that mattered was the truth of the music. She played the sound of her grandmother's laughter. She played the pain of watching the old woman die. She played the loneliness of her childhood, the frustration of her music lessons, the emptiness of playing songs that meant nothing. She played 20 years of silence, 20 years of hiding, 20 years of being invisible. And then she played something else. Hope, joy, freedom, the feeling of finally being herself. The piece she created had no name. It had no structure that any music teacher would recognize. It moved from sadness to anger to joy to peace, following the landscape of his heart. It was messy and imperfect and completely unprofessional. It was also the most honest thing anyone in that concert hall had ever heard. 5 minutes passed, or maybe it was 10, lost track of time. She was aware of nothing except the music flowing through her, out of her, into the world. She did not think about what would happen next. She did not think about the consequences. For the first time in her life, she simply existed in the moment, fully and completely alive. Finally, the music began to slow. The wild notes settled into something gentler, like a storm giving way to calm. Played a final phrase, soft and sweet, like a whispered goodbye. Then she lowered her bow and opened her eyes. The concert hall was completely silent. Every musician on stage was staring at her. Every person in the audience was staring at her. Mister's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than any sound. Then someone in the audience began to clap. It was a slow clap, hesitant and unsure, could not see who it was, but soon another pair of hands joined in, then another, then another. Within seconds, a wave of applause was spreading through the concert hall. Not everyone was clapping. Many people sat with their arms crossed, their faces angry or confused, but enough people were applauding to fill the room with sound. Stood there, her violin still in her hand, not knowing what to feel. She had just destroyed a performance in front of the mayor and national music critics. She had her conductor and embarrassed her orchestra. She had broken every rule she had ever been taught. But she had also kept her promise. After 20 years, she had finally played her real music. She had finally let the world hear who she truly was. Mister stepped down from his podium and walked toward her. His footsteps echoed in the hall, heavy and threatening. The applause died down as people watched, sensing that something was about to happen. The conductor stopped directly in front of. His eyes were like ice, cold and unforgiving. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with controlled rage. "You are finished here," he said. "Get off my stage now." Looked at him. She looked at the orchestra behind her, at the musicians who had been her colleagues for 3 years. Some of them looked sympathetic. Most of them looked relieved that it was not them standing in her place. She wanted to say something, to explain, to defend herself. But what could she say? She had done what she had done. There was no taking it back. And honestly, she did not want to take it back. So she simply nodded. She placed her violin carefully in its case. She picked up her sheet music, the pages that she had ignored and betrayed. And she walked off the stage, her head held high, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she heard Mister trying to restore order. She heard the orchestra begin to play again, picking up where they had left off before her interruption. The music was perfect once more, proper and controlled and completely forgettable. Walked through the backstage door and into the cold night air. She was unemployed. She was probably finished in the classical music world. Her reputation was destroyed. But for the first time in 20 years, she felt free. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if she had just made the best decision of her life or the worst mistake. All she knew was that she had finally told the truth, and whatever came next, she would face it as herself. Not the quiet girl in the back row, not the invisible musician who followed the rules. Just wild and free and finally completely alive. Did not sleep that night. She lay in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening's events over and over in her mind. The music she had played, the faces in the audience, Mr.'s cold words, the sound of applause mixed with angry whispers. Her phone had started buzzing before she even got home. Messages from fellow orchestra members. Missed calls from numbers she did not recognize. She had turned the phone off and thrown it in a drawer, unable to face whatever was waiting for her. Now, as the first gray light of morning crept through her window, she finally gathered the courage to look. She pulled the phone from the drawer and turned it on. Within seconds, it came alive with notifications. 47 missed calls, over 100 text messages, dozens of emails. Her hands trembled as she began to read. "What were you thinking?" wrote Jennifer, the first violin. "You have destroyed your career." "Mr. is furious," wrote Thomas, one of the cellists. "He says he will make sure you never work in classical music again." "That was insane," wrote the friendly cellist who sat near her. "I do not know what to say." Most of the messages were similar: shock, anger, confusion. People she had worked with for 3 years suddenly treating her like a stranger, like a criminal, like someone who had done something unforgivable. But it was the emails that truly made her heart sink. The first one was from the orchestra's manager, officially informing her that she was suspended pending a full review. The second was from a music website, asking for a comment on what they called her meltdown. The third was from her mother. "What is going on? Someone from the newspaper called asking about you. Your father and I are very worried. Please call us." Closed her eyes, she had not even thought about her parents, about what they would think, about how they would react. They had never understood her love of music. They had tolerated it, supported it in their own way, but they had never truly understood. And now this. She scrolled through more messages, her stomach growing heavier with each one. The world was already talking about what she had done. People she had never met were writing about her, judging her, forming opinions about her character based on 5 minutes of music they had not even heard. Then she found an email that made her stop. It was from a sender she did not recognize. The subject line simply said, "Thank you." She opened it. "Dear, I was in the audience tonight. I am not a music critic or an important person. I am just someone who loves music, real music. And what you played tonight was the most real thing I have heard in 20 years. I do not know what happened to you up there. I do not know what made you decide to do what you did, but I want you to know that it mattered. It mattered to me. I have spent my whole life following rules, doing what I was supposed to do, being who I was supposed to be. Watching you tonight made me realize something. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply be themselves. Please do not stop. Do not let them silence you. The world needs more music like yours. With gratitude. A stranger who heard you." Read the message 3 times. Then she read it again. Tears began to fall down her cheeks, but she could not tell if they were tears of sadness or something else entirely. She did not know this person. She would probably never meet them. But somehow, this one message meant more than all the angry texts combined. Someone had heard her. Someone had understood. For those few minutes on stage, she had connected with another human being in a way that her years of perfect playing never had. The phone buzzed again, a news alert. She looked at the screen and felt her stomach drop. "Orchestra musician has public breakdown during performance," the headline read. Critics call it an unforgivable act of self-indulgence. She clicked on the article. It was short and brutal. It described her as an unstable woman who had ruined an otherwise excellent performance. It quoted Mr. saying that her behavior was unprofessional and unacceptable. It quoted a music critic calling her music noise and an insult to the audience. Nowhere did it mention the applause. Nowhere did it mention the people who had seemed moved by what she played. Put down the phone. She walked to her window and looked out at the city waking up below. People were going to work. Cars were filling the streets. The world was continuing on, just as it always did, completely unaware that everything had changed for one small woman in a small apartment. She thought about grandmother, about the old woman who had traveled the world playing her music wherever she wanted. Had she ever faced moments like this? Had she ever been told that her music was wrong, that she was wrong, that she should just follow the rules like everyone else? Probably, almost certainly. But she had not stopped. She had kept playing until the day she died, following her heart instead of other people's expectations. The question was, could do the same. She looked at her violin case, sitting by the door where she had dropped it the night before. That old instrument had been silent for so long, playing only what it was told to play. But last night it had finally sung. It had finally told the truth. The thought of never playing like that again filled with a sadness deeper than anything she had ever felt. The thought of going back to the back row, to the simple parts, to the invisible life she had been living, seemed worse than any public criticism, worse than unemployment, worse than disappointing her parents. But what choice did she have? No orchestra would hire her now. No conductor would trust her. Her career in classical music was over. Even if she wanted to go back to her old life, that door was closed. She was still standing at the window, lost in thought, when her phone buzzed again. Another email from an unknown sender. She almost ignored it, expecting more criticism, but something made her look. The subject line said, "A proposition. Dear, my name is David. I run a small music venue called The Underground. You have probably never heard of it. We are not fancy or famous. We do not attract wealthy audiences or music critics. What we do attract are people who love real music, music that comes from the heart. I was not at your performance last night, but I have seen the video. Yes, someone recorded it and posted it online. It already has 10,000 views. I watched it 5 times. I think what you did was remarkable. I think what you played was unlike anything I have ever heard, and I think you deserve a chance to do it again. I want to invite you to play at the Underground. One night. Any music you want, no rules, no sheet music. Just you and your violin and whatever comes from your soul. I cannot offer you much money. I cannot offer you fame or prestige, but I can offer you a stage and an audience who will actually listen. Think about it. My number is below." David. The Underground. Stared at the email for a long time. Her heart was beating fast. Her hands were shaking again, but this time not from fear. Someone wanted her to play, not the old, the invisible one who followed rules, but the real, the one who had finally shown herself last night. She did not know if she was ready. She did not know if she would ever be ready. But she knew that she could not say no, because saying no would mean going back to silence, going back to hiding, going back to breaking her promise. She picked up her phone and began to type a reply. The video spread faster than anyone expected. By the end of the first day, it had 50,000 views. By the end of the week, it had over 1 million. People shared it on social media with comments that ranged from cruel to kind. Some called crazy. Others called her a genius. Most did not know what to call her at all. Watched the numbers climb from her small apartment, feeling like she was watching someone else's life unfold on a screen. The woman in the video looked like her. She played the violin like her. But the confidence, the passion, the complete lack of fear on that woman's face seemed to belong to a stranger. The comments section was a battlefield. Some people wrote long paragraphs defending her, saying she had done something brave and beautiful. Others wrote angry messages calling her selfish and unprofessional. Musicians from around the world weighed in, some praising her originality, others criticizing her technique. But underneath all the noise, something unexpected was happening. People were reaching out to directly, not critics or journalists, just ordinary people who had felt something when they watched her play. A mother wrote to say that her teenage daughter had stopped practicing violin months ago. After watching this video, she had picked up her instrument again. A man in another country shared that he had spent 30 years working a job he hated, afraid to follow his real dreams. His music had made him cry for the first time in years. A young woman confessed that she had been hiding her own creative work, terrified of being judged. Seeing take that risk had given her courage. These messages arrived by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Each one was like a small light in the darkness, reminding that she was not alone, that what she had done mattered, regardless of what the critics said. Still, she hesitated about the underground. The invitation sat in her inbox, unanswered for 3 days. Each time she tried to write a reply, fear stopped her fingers. What if the concert hall had been a one-time accident? What if she could not recreate that magic? What if she stood on stage at the underground and nothing came out at all? On the 4th day, her phone rang. It was David himself. "I hope I am not bothering you," he said. His voice was warm and casual, not at all what expected from a venue owner. "I just wanted to check if you got my email." "I got it," said. "I have been thinking about it." "That is good. Thinking is important." He paused. "But sometimes thinking too much can be dangerous. Sometimes you just have to jump." Was quiet. Through her window, she could see pigeons landing on the building across the street. Such simple creatures, doing what their instincts told them without worrying about consequences. "I watched the video again this morning," David continued. "The 27th time if you are counting. Each time I see something new. That is rare, you know. Most music, you hear it once and you understand it completely. Your music is different. It has layers. It has secrets." "I did not plan any of it," admitted. "I did not know what I was going to play until I played it." "That is the best kind of music," David said. "The kind that surprises even the person playing it." Took a deep breath. What if I cannot do it again? What if it was just a one-time thing? David laughed softly. "Do you know how many musicians I have met in my life? Hundreds, maybe thousands. I have seen people with perfect technique who play music that puts audiences to sleep. I have seen people with average skill who make everyone in the room cry. The difference is not talent. It is not training. It is truth." He paused to let the words sink in. "What you played that night came from somewhere real. That place does not disappear. It might hide sometimes. It might be hard to find. But it is always there, waiting. You just have to trust it." Felt tears forming in her eyes. She did not know this man. He did not know her. But somehow he understood something about her that she was only beginning to understand herself. "Okay," she said finally, "I will do it." "Wonderful," she could hear the smile in his voice. "Friday night, 8 o'clock, just show up and play whatever wants to come out." After she hung up, sat very still for a long time, she had said yes. She had committed. There was no turning back now. The next few days passed in a blur. Tried to prepare, but she did not know how to prepare for something that had no plan. She picked up her violin a dozen times, but each time she tried to play, the music felt forced. The fire that had burned so brightly at the concert hall seemed to have gone into hiding. By Friday afternoon, she was terrified. She stood in front of her mirror, looking at her reflection. The woman starring back looked tired and scared, nothing like the confident stranger in the video. "What are you doing?" she whispered to herself. "You are going to fail. Everyone will see that you are nothing special. They will realize the video was just an accident." But even as the doubts swirled in her mind, another voice spoke up. A quieter voice but steady. It sounded like grandmother. You made a promise, the voice said. Keep it. Arrived at the Underground at 7:30. The venue was nothing like the Grand City Concert Hall. It was a small basement space with exposed brick walls and mismatched chairs. The lighting was dim and warm. There was no stage, just a cleared area in the corner where performers stood. The ceiling was low, making the space feel intimate, like being inside a secret. David greeted her at the door. He was a small man with gray hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He looked at her violin case and nodded approvingly. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Terrified," admitted. "Good, terror means you care." He led her inside. "Come, let me show you around." The venue was already starting to fill up. People were claiming seats, ordering drinks, talking in low voices. They did not look like the wealthy audience at the concert hall. They were young and old, dressed casually, their faces open and curious. "Word spread about tonight," David explained. "We had to turn people away at the door. Everyone wants to see the woman from the video." Felt her stomach tighten. So many people, so many expectations. What if she disappointed them all? David seemed to sense her fear. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Do not play for them," he said quietly. "Play for yourself. Play for your grandmother. Play for that little girl who fell in love with music before anyone told her how it was supposed to sound. The audience will feel whatever is real." At 8 o'clock, David walked to the center of the room. The crowd fell silent. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said. "We have a very special guest. Some of you may have seen her video. Some of you may have heard the stories. But tonight you get to experience her music in person. No recordings, no distance, just pure live music." He turned and looked at, standing in the shadows with her violin. "Please welcome." There was applause as she walked to the performance area. The faces around her blurred into a sea of shapes and colors. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were shaking as she lifted the violin to her shoulder. For a moment she could not breathe. The room was too full. The silence was too heavy. The weight of everyone's expectations pressed down on her like a physical force. Then she closed her eyes and remembered that she had already lost everything once. Her job, her reputation, her place in the classical music world. She had nothing left to lose. So she began to play. The first note came out wrong. It was thin and shaky, nothing like the powerful sound had produced at the concert hall. She heard someone in the audience shift in their seat. She felt the familiar grip of panic begin to close around her chest. But she did not stop. She kept her eyes closed and let the bow move across the strings again. The second note was better. The third was better still. And slowly, like a rusty engine coming back to life, the music began to flow. It started quietly, a simple melody that rose and fell like breathing. Did not know where it came from. She did not think about it. She just let her hands move and her heart speak through the strings. The melody grew. It became something darker, something deeper. Found herself playing the fear she had felt walking into this room. The terror of standing in front of strangers and showing them her true self. The notes twisted and turned, creating tension that made the air feel heavy. Then something shifted. The darkness gave way to light. The fear transformed into something else. Determination, hope, joy. Played the moment when she had first picked up her grandmother's violin as a child. She played the magic of those early lessons when music was not about rules but about feelings. She played the pure, simple happiness of creating something beautiful. The audience was completely silent. No one moved. No one whispered. They sat frozen in their seats, caught in the spell of music. She played for 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. Time became meaningless. She moved through emotions like traveling through different countries. Sadness, anger, love, grief, peace. Each feeling had its own sound, its own color, its own shape in the air. At some point, she began to incorporate fragments of classical pieces she had learned over the years, but she did not play them the way they were written. She broke them apart and rebuilt them. She mixed with her own wild improvisations. She took a melody and wrapped it in something completely modern. It was like watching someone take famous paintings and turn them into something entirely new. The crowd began to react, not with applause or cheers, but with something deeper. Could feel their energy even with her eyes closed. She could sense their breathing changing, their hearts beating in rhythm with her music. They were not just listening anymore. They were part of the performance. Near the back of the room, a woman began to cry. She did not know why. The music had touched something inside her that she had forgotten existed. Next to her, a man who had not felt anything in years found himself overwhelmed with emotion. A teenage boy who had come with his skeptical friends forgot to be cool and simply listened with his mouth open. Played the story of her life, the lonely childhood, the death of her grandmother, the years of silence and hiding, the moment on stage at the concert hall when everything changed. She played it all, holding nothing back. And then she played her dreams, the future she had been afraid to imagine, a life where she could be fully herself, a world where her music mattered, a place where she belonged. The final notes came slowly, softly, like the last rays of sunset fading into night. Held the last sound for a long moment, letting it hang in the air like a prayer. Then she lowered her bow and opened her eyes. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. Stood there, her violin still pressed against her shoulder, suddenly aware of how tired she was, how completely empty and full at the same time. Then the room exploded. People rose to their feet, applauding and shouting. Some were crying openly, others were laughing with joy. The sound of their appreciation washed over like a wave, almost knocking her off her feet. David was the first to reach her. His eyes were wet with tears. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was unlike anything I have ever witnessed. You did not just play music, you created a new language." People crowded around her, wanting to shake her hand, wanting to tell her what her music had made them feel. Smiled and nodded, overwhelmed by the attention but also strangely comfortable. These people had seen her, the real her, and they had not turned away. A young woman with purple hair pushed through the crowd. She was carrying a notebook covered in stickers. "I write for a music blog," she said breathlessly. "Can I interview you? What you did tonight, it was incredible. People need to hear about this." "I write songs, but I have always been afraid to share them," said an older man with a gentle face. "Watching you tonight gave me courage. Thank you." "Will you play again?" asked a young boy who could not have been more than 12. "I want to learn to play like you." Looked at all of them, these strangers who had become something more, an audience, a community, witnesses to the birth of something new. "I do not know what I will do next," she said honestly. "But I know I cannot go back to being quiet. I cannot go back to being invisible." Later that night, after the crowd had finally gone home, sat alone in the underground. David had given her a key and told her to stay as long as she wanted. She sat in one of the mismatched chairs, her violin case on her lap, looking at the empty room where magic had happened. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it and saw dozens of notifications. The purple-haired blogger had already posted about the performance. People were sharing it, commenting on it, asking when and where they could see play again. One message stood out. It was from the cellist from the orchestra, the only colleague who had been kind to her. "I heard about tonight," his message said. "People are calling it the performance of the year. I always knew there was something special about you. I am glad you finally let it out." Smiled, she typed a simple reply, "Thank you for being kind when no one else was." She put the phone away and looked at her grandmother's violin. The old instrument seemed to glow in the dim light. She imagined grandmother sitting beside her, smiling that wild smile, her eyes full of pride. "I kept my promise," whispered. "I finally found my voice." She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know if this new path would lead to success or failure, fame or obscurity. But for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of the unknown. Because she had discovered something important that night. Something that all the years of training and rules and expectations had never taught her. The most powerful music does not come from following instructions. It does not come from technique or tradition or trying to please others. It comes from the same place where courage lives, the place where truth lives, the deep, wild, untamed center of the human heart. And now that had found that place, she would never lose it again. She stood up, picked up her violin case, and walked out into the night. The city was quiet. The stars were hidden behind clouds, but somewhere inside her, a fire burned brighter than ever. Her journey was just beginning. The months that followed brought changes could never have imagined. After her performance at the Underground, requests began pouring in. Small venues wanted her to play. Music festivals invited her to perform. A record label reached out about recording an album. The woman who had been invisible for 3 years was suddenly everywhere. But success, learned, came with its own kind of pain. The critics remained deeply divided. Some praised her as a revolutionary who was changing the face of classical music. They wrote long articles about her unique style, calling it a bridge between traditional and modern sounds. They compared her to great artists who had broken rules and changed history. Others were far less kind. They called her a fraud who lacked real skill. They said her music was nothing but noise disguised as art. One famous critic wrote a piece titled "The Death of Musical Standards," using as the primary example of everything wrong with contemporary music. "She cannot play a simple scale without turning it into chaos," the critic wrote. "Her so-called creativity is just an excuse for poor technique. She is not an artist. She is a mistake that somehow became famous." Read every review, good and bad. The negative ones cut deep, even when she tried to ignore them. Late at night, alone in her apartment, the harsh words echoed in her mind. Fraud, mistake, noise. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had fooled everyone, including herself. Her former colleagues from the orchestra wanted nothing to do with her. When she ran into Jennifer, the first violin, at a coffee shop one morning, the woman looked at her like she was a stranger. "What you did was unprofessional," Jennifer said coldly. "You embarrassed all of us. Real musicians do not behave that way." "Real musicians play from the heart," replied quietly. Jennifer shook her head. "Real musicians respect the rules. They respect tradition. They do not destroy performances for attention." She walked away without another word. The rejection hurt more than expected. She had spent 3 years with these people. They had not been close friends, but they had been colleagues. Now they treated her like she had committed a crime. Her parents struggled to understand her new life. When she went home to visit, her mother kept asking when she was going to get a real job again. "This music you play now, it is very strange," her mother said, worry in her voice. "Cannot you go back to the orchestra? I am sure they would take you if you apologized." "I do not want to go back," said. "I am finally doing what I was meant to do." Her father sat quietly in his chair, the same chair he had sat in for 30 years. He did not say much, but could see the confusion in his eyes. His daughter had become someone he did not recognize. "Your grandmother played strange music too," he finally said. "Look where it got her, traveling the world with nothing, no stability, no security. Is that what you want?" Thought about it. Was that what she wanted? A life without guarantees, a future built on something as fragile as art. "Grandmother was the happiest person I ever knew," she said. "She had nothing, but she had everything. She was free." Her father shook his head but did not argue further. Some things could not be explained to people who had never felt them. The hardest challenge came from within. As fame grew, so did the pressure to produce more music. People expected her to be brilliant every time she performed. They expected each show to be as powerful as the one at the Underground. And sometimes, No matter how hard she tried, the magic did not come. There were nights when she stood on stage and felt nothing. The fire in her chest that had burned so brightly seemed to flicker and fade. The music that came out was okay, but not extraordinary, not the life-changing experience people had come to expect. After one particularly difficult performance, sat backstage with her head in her hands. David found her there, tears streaming down her face. "I have lost it," she whispered. "Whatever I had, it is gone. I am empty." David sat down beside her. He did not try to hug her or offer comforting words. He just sat in silence for a while, letting her feel what she needed to feel. "Do you know what the hardest part of being an artist is?" he finally asked. "It is not the criticism. It is not the rejection. It is the expectation that you must be great every single time, but that is not how art works. Art is like the ocean. Sometimes there are waves, sometimes there is calm. Both are natural, both are necessary." Looked at him through her tears. "But people paid money to see me. They came expecting something special." "And they got something special," David said. "They got you, not the legend, not the video, just you, a human being doing her best. That is enough. That is always enough." His words stayed with her through the difficult months that followed. She learned to accept that she could not control her art. She could only show up, be present, and let whatever wanted to come out come out. Some nights it was fire. Some nights it was quiet. But it was always honest, and that was what mattered. The people who truly understood her music became like family. They were not the wealthy patrons or the famous critics. They were ordinary people who had felt silenced in their own lives. People who came to her shows and wept because her music gave voice to feelings they could not express. People who wrote to her saying that her courage had inspired them to take their own risks. A young girl named Sophie became a regular at performances. She was 15 years old and had been told by her music teacher that she would never be good enough to play professionally. "Your music taught me that good enough is not the point," Sophie told after a show. "Being real is the point. Being brave is the point." Hugged the girl and felt tears prick her eyes. This was why she had broken the rules. This was why she had risked everything, not for fame or money or critical approval, but for moments like this, connections like this, the knowledge that her truth had touched someone else's heart. The price of breaking free was high. Lost friends, disappointed her family, faced constant criticism, and struggled with her own doubts. But she also gained something that could not be measured: purpose, community, the freedom to be fully and completely herself. One night, after a performance that had been neither spectacular nor terrible, just honest, sat alone on the roof of her apartment building. The city lights spread out below her like a carpet of stars. The air was cool, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear music playing from an open window. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the quiet girl who had hidden her true music under her bed, the invisible woman in the back row of the orchestra, the terrified performer who had closed her eyes and let the fire finally burn. She was still scared sometimes. She still doubted herself. She still wondered if she was good enough, real enough, brave enough. But she also knew something now that she had not known before. The fear never goes away completely. The doubts never stop coming. The critics never stop criticizing. But none of that matters if you are living your truth, if you are playing the music that only you can play, if you are being the person that only you can be. That was worth any price. That was worth everything. Smiled and looked up at the stars that were just beginning to peek through the city lights. Tomorrow there would be more challenges, more performances, more chances to succeed or fail. But tonight she was at peace. And that was enough. 5 years had passed since that night at the Grand City Concert Hall. 5 years since had closed her eyes, ignored her sheet music, and let the fire inside her finally burn free. The world had changed in those 5 years, and so had she. Stood backstage at the International Music Festival, the largest classical music event in the country. 20,000 people filled the outdoor arena, their voices creating a hum of excitement that she could hear even through the thick curtains. In a few minutes, she would walk onto that stage and play for more people than she had ever played for in her life. But this time she was not afraid. A young woman appeared beside her, clutching a violin case nervously. It was Sophie, now 20 years old, no longer the insecure teenager who had once been told she would never be good enough. She had become student 3 years ago, and tonight she would perform alongside her teacher for the first time. "I think I'm going to be sick," Sophie said, her face pale. Smiled, "I know the feeling. I felt it too once." "How did you get over it?" Thought about the question. How do you explain courage to someone who is still learning what it means? How do you teach someone to trust the fire inside them? "I did not get over it," she said honestly. "I just learned to move forward anyway. The fear never goes away completely, but it gets quieter when you trust yourself, when you remember that your music matters, regardless of what anyone else thinks." Sophie nodded, taking a deep breath. "What if I make a mistake?" "Then you make a mistake, and you keep playing. Mistakes are not failures. They are just unexpected turns in the journey. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the moments when things do not go according to plan." She thought of her own journey, the moment of chaos at the orchestra, the video that had spread around the world, the years of criticism and self-doubt. None of it had gone according to plan, and yet here she was. The stage manager appeared. "5 minutes, Ms." Squeezed Sophie's hand. "Remember why you started playing. Remember the first time you picked up a violin and felt something magical. That magic is still inside you. Trust it." She walked toward the stage entrance, her grandmother's violin tucked under her arm. The same instrument that had traveled the world with grandmother. The same instrument that had been silent for so many years in orchestras and practice rooms. It had finally found its true purpose, and tonight it would sing for 20,000 people. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and please welcome the artist who has changed the face of contemporary music, the woman who turned chaos into art." The curtains parted, walked into the light. The applause that greeted her was like thunder, 20,000 people rising to their feet, clapping and cheering before she had even played a single note. She looked out at the sea of faces, each one representing a person who had heard her music and been moved by it. A person who had taken a chance on something different, something unexpected, something real. She lifted her violin to her shoulder and waited for the crowd to settle. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. And then she began to play. The music that poured from her violin that night was unlike anything she had played before. It contained all the years of her journey, the loneliness of her childhood, the death of her grandmother, the silence of the orchestra years, the terror of breaking free, the pain of criticism, the joy of finding her voice, the love of the people who had believed in her. She played for 30 minutes without stopping. The music moved through moods and styles, sometimes loud and wild, sometimes soft and tender. At one point, Sophie joined her on stage, their 2 violins creating harmonies that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. Near the end, played something new, a piece she had been working on for months, inspired by all the people who had written to her over the years. The mother whose daughter had started playing again. The man who had finally followed his dreams. The young people who had found courage in her story. She called the piece Permission. Because that was what her music had always been about, she realized. Not breaking rules for the sake of breaking rules. Not chaos for the sake of chaos, but giving people permission to be themselves. Permission to feel deeply. Permission to create without fear. Permission to be wild and free and beautifully imperfect. The final note hung in the air for a long moment before fading into silence. Then the crowd erupted. The standing ovation lasted for 15 minutes. People were crying, laughing, hugging strangers beside them. The energy in the arena was electric, alive, transformative. stood on stage, her violin at her side, tears streaming down her face. She thought about the girl she had been 5 years ago, the invisible woman who had been afraid to play a single note that was not on a page. She wished she could go back in time and tell that girl what was coming. Tell her that it would be hard, but it would be worth it. Tell her that her voice mattered. Tell her to trust the fire. But she could not go back. She could only move forward. In the weeks that followed, was credited with starting a movement. Young musicians around the world were experimenting with new styles, mixing classical training with personal expression. Music schools were updating their programs to encourage creativity alongside technique. The rules had not been thrown away, but they had been expanded to make room for something more human. The critics who had once dismissed began to change their tune. Some of them, at least. They called her a pioneer, a visionary, a force of nature. Concert halls that had once banned her now begged her to perform. She was featured in magazines and documentaries, held up as an example of what happens when someone dares to be different. But did not care much about the fame or the recognition. What mattered to her were the small moments, the letters from strangers who had found courage through her music, the students like Sophie who were learning to trust themselves, the quiet knowledge that she had lived her truth, regardless of the cost. One autumn evening, visited her grandmother's grave for the first time in years. She brought her violin and sat in the grass beside the headstone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "It took me a long time, but I finally did it. I did not let them silence me." She lifted the violin to her shoulder and played a quiet melody, something gentle and sweet, like a lullaby. The music drifted across the cemetery, carried by the wind to wherever music goes when it leaves the world. When she finished, sat in silence for a while, feeling the peace that came from knowing she had done what she was meant to do. In interviews, people always asked her the same question. What gave you the courage to do what you did? What made you decide to risk everything? Always gave the same answer. "I was not brave," she would say. "I was just tired of being invisible. I was tired of playing music that meant nothing. I was tired of hiding the best parts of myself because I was afraid of what people would think." She would pause then and look at whoever was interviewing her with those honey-colored eyes that had seen so much. The truth is, we are all carrying music inside us, dreams that want to be lived, voices that want to be heard. Most of us spend our whole lives keeping them quiet, following rules, staying in our assigned seats. But every once in a while, someone decides they have had enough. Someone decides to stop being ordinary. She would smile then, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. That is not bravery, that is just finally being honest. And once you start being honest, you cannot go back. You would not want to. Lived to be 93 years old. She performed until the very end, her music never losing its fire. When she died, peacefully in her sleep, they found her grandmother's violin beside her bed. It was finally still, finally silent. But the music she had created lived on, in recordings and memories, in the students she had taught and the lives she had touched, in every person who had ever dared to break free from their ordinary lives and play the music that only they could play. Her story became a reminder to the world that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen when ordinary people refuse to stay quiet, when they close their eyes, trust their hearts, and let the fire inside them finally burn free.